Well, I think it's critical, and I'm speaking from first person perspective here because, like I said, I'm sitting in a position now that 20 years ago I despised as a subservient, right? And I think that had I not done the work, both professionally and personally, I couldn't be the leader I am, honestly. And um, I don't think that I would get the outcomes that I have.
Welcome back to another episode of the No Half Cakes podcast. With me today is a guest that I am honored and excited to share with you. This is someone that I have met a number of years ago and has continued to just flourish and blossom, and I am super excited to share her with you. She is a speech pathology professional, a doctor, Dr. Dana Battaglia, who specializes in communication. And man, that, if you know me, communication is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And there is just so much goodness that's going to come out of this conversation. I physically cannot wait any longer. So without further ado, I am honored to share with you today Dr. Dana Battaglia. Dana, thank you for joining us.
Jim, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Me too. I'm honored that you've offered to kind of take the stage with me here and share this, specifically because communication is such a near and dear topic to my heart. I fully believe that communication can solve so many things. Understanding how communication works, knowing how to communicate, what to communicate, and how to receive, I think is such an important part of that. And for you to be able to share that insight with us is something I'm pumped for, honestly, on a personal level.
Thanks, Jim. I mean, I'll try and be succinct, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
We sure will. So take me through a little bit of kind of the background. How do you get into this topic of speech and language? Like, where does this passion and this drive come from for you?
Oh my God. Okay, so I'm not going to go over like the professional credentialing stuff. We're not going to go there, but just in terms of my personal journey. So I grew up in a bilingual home, and when I started college, I knew that I was interested in language, and I was interested in helping others. Right. So those were the two things I knew. I thought I might major in world languages and psychology. That's what I thought I was going to be exploring. And then I found speech language pathology, which really is a field that is focused on either habilitating or rehabilitating individuals who can't communicate. And I was like, you know what? That's it. And really, I feel so lucky because I found that at a very young age and I was hyper focused and I never changed. And, while my career has shifted for sure, it's always been focused on helping others to communicate and helping myself to be an effective communicator in whatever leadership capacities I may have had. I have.
I love that.
Yeah.
So now you talked a little bit about people who maybe have difficulty communicating. And you've done a lot of work in like the autism field, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How much of that do you think is unique to autism versus, I think those tips may be applicable on a much larger scale?
Yeah.
Where do you see that?
So, I mean, I think that that's such a great question because my passion really lies if I had to pick, let's say, a clinical population in working with individuals with autism. But and it's really a very unique population because there are so many interesting language characteristics that are unique to autism specifically, and yet there's so much we don't understand, right? So it's really a mystery, and that's why I love working with autistic individuals because I feel like every day I learn something new, right? Which is it keeps me fresh and on my toes and creative. So that being said, when you think about, interventions in general, a parallel area of research that I'm very curious about and I talk about is universal design for learning. And what that means is rather than focusing on one person's deficit, let's say in a classroom or in a working space, right? Um, or one person's unique abilities, let's say, creating a space, an environment, a communication environment, and learning environment where you might have that person's goals in mind, but you apply the intervention to everyone equally, right? So that's what's called universal design. I mean, it's much more complicated than that. But basically, what happens is you're lifting the entire group as opposed to isolating someone who maybe needs a different kind of support. And the feedback that I've gotten in that is really that my spaces tend to be very safe, very conducive to learning, conducive to sharing. And I think that the output, whatever a team goal might be or a classroom objective might be, really is always maximized as a result.
I like that. So let me understand if I heard that correctly. Because one of the things that I often say is people have an innate need to feel loved, seen, heard, and appreciated.
For sure.
And feeling heard, I think is a large part of that. So what you're saying there is rather than speaking to the audience as a whole, or the team as a whole, or the classroom as a whole, and then singling out one person to speak to them individually based on how they need to be heard or need to be received,
Hmm.
you're sort of taking in all the different people on the team, pulling in all their individual needs, and then essentially broadcasting in a way that will speak to each of them individually.
Yes, and giving everyone the same access. So let me give you an example.
Sure.
When I was teaching in higher education, full time, I still am now as an adjunct, but at the time. And in the fall, there are many Jewish holidays, right? So my students who were observant would come to me either uncomfortably or privately and say, this is my holiday. I'm going to be out. My friend is going to record the class for me, so that I can have the, access to the lecture. And, over a few years of that, I started to realize like, this is not right. Like, this doesn't feel right to me. Not that the student was out, but that this accommodation was necessary. So instead, I just started podcasting all of my lectures so that there was never a need for a student to come to me with maybe intimidation or fear. There's always that inherent power differential between a teacher and a student. And what happened was all the students had all the access to all my lectures all the time. So everyone benefited from that one thoughtful accommodation, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's a great point.
Yeah.
uh, I think on a lot of different levels. One is making it accessible, right? I don't think it's necessary to gatekeep. I think a lot of us look to gatekeep information like, hey, you're either there or you're not, and if you're not, tough luck.
Correct.
But
Correct.
if you truly desire to build a stronger team or a stronger classroom or really benefit the people, then why hold back?
Right.
So I think that's a great point, and definitely, like you said, that power differential is huge in perception for a lot of people, right? They feel
Absolutely.
like whether that's in a family or a corporate structure, they feel like they're afraid to ask because they might be judged.
Right.
So how much do you think of that communication is mitigating that power differential, is really leveling the playing field to allow people to feel free to communicate?
Right. Right. So I'm not sure if that was a question or a comment.
Bit of a question, bit of both.
Well, I think that there's always going to be that. Like, that's just part of, this is I'm speaking from my perspective, I think there's always going to be a power differential, right? Um, what I know is that me continuing to say, come to me, don't be nervous to come to me, don't be nervous to come to me, didn't work, right? It
Right.
doesn't work. Um, and what I have done in the past is made requirements where students had to come to me early on in the classes. And what happened was they realized that, you know, making it a habit and knowing that I'm really authentic in my request and that I'm there to support students when they really need me, um, came through in those kinds of activities. So just saying, hey, I have open office hours, come visit me, I'm always open for you, really doesn't work. But what I would do is I would cancel an entire class and have appointment slots where all the students had to come see me, and that counted as their attendance. And then they came, and I asked them. I had like the same standard questions for every student, and the first one I would lead with was, "What do you like to do for fun?" And when that started happening, students realized that I actually do care about having them seen and heard and felt cared for and loved. And it made for a really collaborative working environment.
That is such a great point. And yeah, I mean, I see so many parallels within the family structure, the corporate structure for that.
Oh, totally.
I think it's so much the same where, you look from a typical traditional leadership perspective, whether that's the parent to the child or the boss to the employee, like, hey, you can come talk to me at any point in time. And just because you say it, you then expect them to just do that thing or to feel that certain way. But it takes work to kind of build that relationship, that trust factor, not just say, I'm your boss, you should trust me, you should come to me, but like
Right.
actually putting in the work to build that relationship and get to their level.
That's
Um,
right.
yeah, I think that's such an important part.
Yeah.
So, how
Another point.
much?
Oh, I'm
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead. No,
No,
please,
I
please
was
go.
going to say another point too that's really important is the aftermath, I call it, like the circling back, right? So you build this relationship, and then whomever you're working with knows they can come to you, and then they come to you, right? Now they come to you in a different context. They come to you in a crisis. They come to you in for a favor. They come to you to bounce an idea, whatever the case may be, right? What I find is also very important then is the circling back. So, I'll leave a conversation and say, do you feel like you need more support from me, or do you feel like you need me to um, be present with you in this meeting, or do you need me to? And most of the time they'll say no, which is great, right? But then I'll set in my calendar like 2 weeks later a note to myself to circle back to that person and just be like, hey, we left off on such and such a meeting, and we talked about a concern that you had with X. You know, are you still feeling that way, or has that since been resolved, or is there any way I could support you further at this point? And again, I think it's that circling back, that's really um, it builds trust, and people know that they can come to you.
I agree. Especially I think a lot of people too in that initial situation when you ask out of fear of disappointment or fear of judgment will say, "Nah, I'm good. I don't need it." But then a day later they realize, "Holy crap, maybe I do need help." But they're either afraid to ask or afraid to admit it.
Right.
So I think what you said there, following back and kind of circling back on that is super important.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I like that. Especially, it's simple, but setting a calendar reminder for it just to say, hey, let me check back in on this
Yeah.
is it's a very smart thing to do. I think a lot of
Yeah, and I
people
do it
think,
before I leave the meeting because, to be honest, I won't remember.
yeah, and I
You
think a lot
know.
of people think maybe it's not as genuine or it's not as intentional to then live by a calendar. But just because you set a reminder for it doesn't mean in the interaction you're not actually genuinely
Correct.
caring about the response.
Yep.
So that's a great point, and I think, yeah, even personally, I think I can take something away from that just to be a little bit more intentional about calendaring things. I think a
Yeah.
lot of people look at just because you put it on a calendar makes it feel kind of automated and not personal. But hey, if it helps you stay accountable to that and have those conversations, then
Yeah.
why not?
Yeah.
So,
I
how
know.
much of that is unique to the autism realm, like the
Okay.
communication style? Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So we kind of started talking about like leadership and pedagogy and stuff, but going back to autism, I mean, you know, my love of communication is always going to be there, irrespective of any clinical population. However, as I led with, working with individuals with autism is very unique because you have this dance between behavior and communication, right? And it's very interesting. And I talk about this a lot, that it's really two fields of research, right? There's this behavioral field, and then there's this speech language communication fields. And historically, they did not get along, these two fields. However, I feel exactly the equal and opposite of that. And most of my colleagues in autism are in the behavior world and not the speech pathology world, which is very funny. So I'm a little bit of an anomaly. It's the way I live my life, and I always have. Um, but again, when you think about the unique characteristics of autism, you always have to consider behavior. What is the motivation behind, let's say, throwing a desk, right? If a child's throwing a desk because they're in the middle of a temper tantrum, you might have an administrator, a teacher, and I'm not saying anything bad about these individuals. I'm just saying, in a classroom environment or a school environment, who says, oh, he's out of control. He's really a tough kid. And those things in that moment may be that person's truth, right? But from my perspective, I always want to look at, well, what is driving this behavior? And most, if not all of the time, it's lack of communication, right? So there's a whole field that talks about functional communication training that's really founded in autism, but can be broadened. And what that looks at is replacing a maladaptive behavior, such as my example before of throwing a desk, with something functional based on the motivation. So the functional part would be, let's say, if a task is too hard and the child wants to get out of it for whatever reason, and they feel the need to escape, right? So it's an escape maintain behavior. Rather than throwing the desk, teaching the child to say, this is hard. Can I go take a walk? Right? It sounds so simple. But when you're in the heat of the moment and you have a classroom and you don't have an aide and you don't have a speech pathologist on your side or a behavior analyst on your side, it's very hard. So those are the unique pieces of working with individuals with autism. That's my passion. And that is what has broadened into, like I said, in all other aspects of my work, my home life, and everything else.
I'm going to ask a question, or maybe this is a statement. I'm not really sure yet, but I don't know enough about this topic, but I'm starting to really
I'm still learning.
understand. Okay, good, great. Because as you're saying this to me, the way I see it, people who have been diagnosed or given autism as a diagnosis, I think their example of the gap between behavior and communication is a little bit more easily defined than
Mhm.
the average other person. But I do think that that gap is still present for most people. I think that there
Mhm.
is um, definitely scenarios I can think of as you're kind of explaining that where people who have not been diagnosed with autism may throw a desk out of frustration because they have a difficulty communicating the thing that is going on. Or maybe it's
Mhm.
not throwing a desk, maybe it's acting out in some other way, maybe it's
Mhm.
being resentful or whatever the output is. I do think that there are situations where people who don't have autism who can't communicate either because they physically don't know how or they've been made to feel uncomfortable in doing so
Mhm.
will act out in another way because that's all they know how to do. Would you say
Yeah.
that's fairly accurate?
No, no. I think that what you're saying is absolutely true. Because, well, first of all, if we just go back to autism, the inherent diagnosis of autism has the interface of communication and behavior. So yes, it is more clear cut, even though within autism there are so many nuances, right? But what you're really leaning into and talking about is really when we think about trauma informed care, right? And knowing that we all come to the table with our stuff, whatever that stuff may be, right? And we all come with areas of strength and limitations. Like that's just humanity, some more than others, but if you think about, now I'm in a situation in my current workspace where I work with middle school and high school students in public education, right? Some have autism, most of them don't. Um, and we have high rates of school refusal, high rates of in home suspension. And most of the time, it comes from this inability, in the moment to communicate effectively, to maybe not engage, which is also part of communication when okay, it's safer for me to step back, you know, or it's part of the culture of you know, a home life that they've been exposed to, you know, and some of it has to do with, you know, a lot of what's going on in our political climate, not to make this a conversation about politics, but just in general, you know. So the point is that, you know, behavior and communication are always hand in hand. You know, it just, from a clinical perspective, when we talk about autism, it's a robust, the majority of the conversation. But that conversation is ever present for all kids. You know, think about kids with ADHD. You know, my son has ADHD, and he'll tell me, like, my inside body doesn't match my outside body right now. But he tells me that because he has the unfortunate circumstance of having a mother who's a speech language pathologist and a father who's an occupational therapist. So, you know, he's very empowered in that way, where I would say a lot of kids aren't.
Right. And when they can't express that, that's when that expression comes out in the form of bad grades, bad behavior, messy rooms, whatever else, other stuff, because they don't know how
Right.
to verbalize or communicate that.
Right.
Whew, that's a good one. So,
Yeah. It's a lot.
yeah, it is a lot. And what I'm thinking here, and maybe to make this a little bit more applicable to everyone listening, I saw an example the other day of when you're driving in the car and the car in front of you has a bumper sticker that says, "Please be patient, I'm a student driver." You have an expectation when interacting with that person, right? You're set in a certain mindset that, hey, you maybe give them a little bit more grace because you understand they're new at this. If they're
Hmm.
struggling with their left and right turn signal, you understand it's okay because they're just starting out. But there's an easily recognizable label that's physically on the car. You can understand, hey, this is the circumstance. But we as humans operating in the real world here, walking around, talking to people in the grocery store, at work, whatever, don't have those bumper stickers on us that say, take it easy on me. I'm dealing with a divorce. I'm dealing with a death in the family. I'm dealing with
Right.
whatever else that is going on. So we kind of default to just expecting everyone to be at this certain level all the time.
It's
Whereas I
true.
think if you come at people with this uh, grace, with this ability to wait a second to kind of gauge where they're at before you
Hmm.
immediately just spew, I think that opens up communication to be a little bit more comfortable and productive.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you, and I raise you on that because, you know, I will tell you that even though I've always been in this profession, I've always been a go, go, go kind of a person, you know, go do the research, go do this, go do that, go help those kids. This work is very important. Like, it was always motivated and good, but it was always like on a hamster wheel, right? And then, you know, sometimes you need some humbling experiences, and that happened for me. You know, during COVID, I had some very significant health issues, not COVID, but certainly related to mental health. Um, and, you know, the other day I was in CVS and I was walking, and I was in a rush, and I was walking behind someone who was really, really slow. And normally that would have made me lose it, you know? And I just took a breath and I said, you know what? We don't have to be in a rush right now. Like, I don't have to be in this rush right now. And I didn't have to be in the rush. I just was, because I'm always in a rush. You know, so again, it's more of that. You don't need that bumper sticker. Just assume, you know, which also goes back to my professional practices in terms of UDL. You know, give everyone access. You know, it's more of
Right.
like a philosophy and not really a practice. Or maybe both.
Yeah. I think, and that's the important part about communication too, from my perspective, and I'd love for you to challenge me on this too, is that, I think so many times people look at communication as a one way, but it's not just what you say, but understanding what the other person receives, right? And knowing not just you have a thing on your heart or on your mind that you want to say, so you just say it and then you just put it out, right? But it's about understanding what that other person is going to receive
Hmm.
as well. So I think it's that two way, and not just being in such a rush all the time, and being so quick to spew stuff out, but really taking the time to actually engage with people, not
Yeah.
just spew it out and keep it moving.
Yeah. Well, that is the definition of communication, right? So it's a two-way street and involves two people, and there has to be a sender and a receiver. So there could be a sender, but no receiver, right? And then it's really not communication. It's like you said, it's spewing, you know. And I remember, again, just going back to the days when I was teaching full time, where I was very proud of myself because I was an over communicator and I was just constantly, these are the deadlines, this is what's happening, and I was very constantly sending out messages, whether it was via email or post or in class. And I remember being so offended at the end of the semester because the students were like, "Well, she's communicating too much and making us stressed out." And I was like, "Well, what's the alternative? If I didn't tell them all this information and then they would be stressed out because they didn't know things were coming, you know?" But the truth is in both situations, under communicating and over communicating, I was not communicating, right? So it's
Right.
about figuring out a way to send a message that is received. And what I've also learned in my own life's journey is that you have to know who your listeners are or who your players are, let's say, or who your team is, right? And if you know that if you have those relationships, because it's relationship based, and you know that if I send it this way, so and so is not going to receive it, you have two choices. Well, you always have more than two, but let's just say we have two choices here. One is to adapt to that person's receiving style or withdraw from the engagement, right? So sometimes I'll be honest with you, sometimes I just choose not to engage because I have to decide how much of my own spiritual energy I'm going to invest. And
Right.
that's a reality, right? And that sounds a little harsh, but it is true.
No, it is, and I think it's an important part to understand because there's there's a balance between, I think, how to protect your energy and your time,
Correct.
or to be too egotistical and demand everyone to bend to your will.
Right.
So I think there's a fine line there between, because I've certainly seen some people who are in the leadership space who say, "I'm the boss, I'm the CEO, this is what I want. I'm saying this thing, and you're going to either just hear it or you're going to leave." And they don't want to spend the extra time to maybe deliver it in a different way or adjust it because they're the boss and their word is, be all end all.
Right.
Um, and I see that causing so much lack of productivity, of pain, of
Mm-hmm.
discomfort, of non-team spirit. But yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like I said, like in my own life's journey, every time I make a decision that's major, I really think about the spiritual energy. How much energy is this going to take from me versus give to me? And again, it's really not selfish. I've learned it's that I cannot serve others if I don't do that.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. No,
I
I agree.
used to
And
be a yes person. I used to say yes all the time for lots of reasons. There's the social desirability piece. You know, and we could have a separate podcast just on that. And also because you don't want to disappoint anyone, and you want to do good things, and you want to do whatever initiatives are presented in front of you because they sound exciting and fun and all of the things.
right.
But as we become more humanized, we realize that I can only be as productive as my body will allow, my mental health will allow, and I have to do that by protecting my spirit.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand what the cost is always, because
Hmm.
there's always going to be an offset in some degree, especially when you're looking at functioning at a high level on the professional side of the world. How does that
Yeah.
work in tandem with the personal side? Right.
Right.
So could you speak a little bit to how your professional pursuit works with your personal and family life?
Yeah. So I had a career pivot during COVID where, I had earned my doctorate and I had naturally shifted to more of a research focus and a pedagogical focus at the higher ed level. And I was a tenured professor and I was working, and then I later became department chair. And, I was climbing the ladder, doing the things, and I was really happy and inspired and all of it. But what I realized was that I just kept taking on more. And I didn't realize that at the moment. And I kept taking on more and taking on more. And it got to a point where I just couldn't do it anymore. And you don't realize that until things happen, right? You have epiphanies, you realize people are not who they are. You realize that you lose your passion, and all of those things happened pretty much at once for me. So, you know, I could have stayed exactly where I was and made it work. I could have definitely made it work. But I chose not to because I was no longer aligned. So I said to myself, what kind of a job could I explore that will give me more time home? Because people have this illusion, by the way, that when you work in academia, you hardly work because you teach 2 hours and then you go home. But that's such a small component of the job description, but students don't know that,
Right.
parents of students don't know that. Um, so it's very interesting. Like that's a whole other conversation. But, I was working, 80 hours a week until 2 o'clock in the morning, every weekend, all the time. Cause you're constantly putting out fires. I started calling myself a traffic cop. I was just kind of telling people where to go, which office to go to, and that kind of thing. So it was very interesting because my roots really started in the public schools. And when I was growing in the public schools, it was kind of like it's like that sliding doors moment. So at the age and at the time where I was in the public schools, and let's say I had about 8 years in terms of my clinical practice, most of my colleagues at the time were going for their administrative licenses. And I was like, why the hell would you do that? That's like a horrible job. You're constantly bowing down to finance. You're telling people no all of the time. It's miserable. I have bigger questions than that. And notice I'm, speaking with a little twang of arrogance. I'm going to go for my PhD. And I did. And by the way, I don't regret that, just so you know. And I did. And that led me again down the road of academia. But when I realized that wasn't working for me, I said, well, what could I do? I have all this like life knowledge, this research knowledge, um, this experience running meetings, plus the passion for the clinical side. I said, you know what? Maybe I'll go back to schools as an administrator. And I'm laughing, but that's what I did. And I'm very happy, and it's funny, but I think I needed to travel that path and make those turns to get to this point. Um, I haven't answered your question yet about the work life balance. First of all, there is no such thing. You know, I try to look at it as a synergy. So there's going to be more times where, the week before Christmas break, my son was sick and my husband were sick. The week before Christmas break, like that's like a no. You don't
Right.
you're not out of schools the week before Christmas break in the public schools, so like you have that. And then we had Christmas break, and now we're getting back today and tomorrow. So I try to look at it as my energy flows based on where I'm needed most in any given moment. I'm about to enter annual review season, which is a little bit cuckoo bananas. It's almost like tax season for accountants. So from February to the end of May, I'm going to be inundated. And last year, I had a couple of nights where I pulled some all-nighters, but it was a couple. It wasn't every night. It wasn't habit. It wasn't practice. I'm blessed. I have an amazing spouse, my husband, who supports me, and I couldn't do any of this without him. But it's the work life balance is significantly different, And again, it was by my choosing. Now, there was no such thing as a dream job. It's not my dream job. But my hope is that every day I plant seeds and that, I always go with my best foot forward, knowing that I'm doing the best thing I can in every circumstance with all the information I have in one moment.
I would agree strongly to that. Yeah, and I often say that work life balance is BS. It's more like work life harmony, right?
Yeah.
Because things are going to ebb and flow depending upon the situation. And given the topic of communication, I kind of want to ask, when looking at a moment in time, like you said, the week before Christmas, your son is sick, your husband's sick. I'm sure you've got all the stuff to try and figure out for Christmas itself, for
Oh
work
yeah, we
world.
were hosting.
There's a lot going on, and that puts another layer of pressure on your plate, right? So when it comes to communication and it comes to relationships, how important do you think it is to communicate that added load on yourself to the people around you in that environment?
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, I'm still working on that. To say that I've arrived would be lying. But I'm definitely trying. So what I'll do is, I'll look at my calendar and I'll sit down with my husband and say, okay, this week we have this, we have that, we have this, we have that, and he'll tell me, oh, I know I have this and I have that, and we just work it out, you know, um, because he was sick. Also, um, he took some time off, and then I took some time off because unfortunately, then I got sick because that's just right. That's like living in a
That
house. It's
works.
just a
Yep.
germ festival, and so we just did it. We just tag teamed. We did our. We tapped out, and we tagged in and tapped out and did what we had to do, and that's how we do it. You know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No,
I know that's not very profound, but it's the truth.
but I do think it's an important part that a lot of people gloss over, right? You try and I think for a lot of people, when you get in that moment where you've got overwhelmed, you've got so much going on, a lot of people resort to going inward and to try and just hustle and grind their way through it and do what they have to do because they are overwhelmed and they don't communicate to the people around them, hey, I'm in a spot where right now I've got 400 things to do, but I only have capacity for 30.
Yeah.
Like, let me communicate that to you so you understand, hey, when you come to me, I'm already in this spot, right? So
Yeah.
you understand when you're coming to me, I'm not at 100% capacity where I can give you X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to need for you to do, one, two, and three for me. So I think that level of communication where it kind of goes both ways is super important for everyday life,
Yeah.
right? And to bring this back, I think when you look at a diagnosis like autism, it to me it makes it a little bit more bumper sticker-ish for people to approach that conversation knowing, hey, all right, I already know going in, I've got to come to the situation with these communication styles. But we somehow forget that that's still applicable for the rest of our life and the rest of our relationships,
Right.
right? We just think, hey, all right, cool, this person has autism, I'm going to speak to them in this certain way because that's how they need to receive it. But then I go and turn this way and I talk to everyone else and I forget that they need those same things too. It's just not as
Right.
clearly defined, so they just say screw it.
And I was guilty of that too. You know, which is shameful because I should know better. But that's also part of the human condition, right? Like you
Right.
said, like it's basically, you're changing a scenario, right? So this child has autism, this one doesn't. So I'm going to talk to this one differently than I talk to that one, which there is a piece of like human, like individuality that needs to be celebrated. And let's
Of
not
course.
forget that. But when we talk about support, we should support all learners and all students and all children and all
100%.
adults,
And I think
you
to bring
know?
it back to where you kind of started with this is that inclusivity part, right?
Hmm.
Where you are speaking to everyone at the same level, you're including everyone, and it's not you're giving this person extra attention, everyone else just gets whatever's left,
Yeah.
right? It's approaching every relationship with what does this person need? Where are they at in this current moment? How can I effectively communicate that to them so that they receive it, right? Because it's not just about speaking, it's not just about what you say, it's not just about making sure they hear it, but that they really receive it into a spot where they can understand it and use it. So I think that level of communication is super important across the board.
Yeah. And another thing too, I always try to think about is, I always say when I'm running a meeting now, I always say, and I say this, I say, it's very important to me to include all voices at the table. And at this point, before we conclude, is there anything that anyone else would like to say? Or has everyone said what they felt that they needed to say? Now, again, if I just say that once and someone might have something they want to say, they may not share it, right? But it's more of building that culture of trust prior to that statement where people feel comfortable to say, well, actually, I wanted to add, well, actually, no one should be clawing for a seat at the table,
Right.
which is a bigger conversation anyway, but just in general, like if I can do that in my little micro space, it's, how they say, how do you change the world? It starts with you. So the way I feel is like if I'm running a meeting, no one should have to claw to get their voice heard.
100%. I think that there's a gap there, and I think that gap is ego, where a lot of people in the leadership perspective, whether it's running a family, a business, or just a conversation, where they'll say, "Does anyone need to say anything?" Like, okay, they said it, cool, but
Right,
unless they act out the other 365 days, the feeling of letting that person be seen, heard, loved, and appreciated, you're not going to have that comfort level where they're going to feel okay to say anything, right? So just because you said, "Does anyone need to say anything?" doesn't mean that person's going to feel comfortable
correct.
to say something, right? So there has to
Right,
be that congruency in how you act and carry yourself, right? So they know, okay, just because I said it, I'm good, I'm covered. No, you're not, right? You
right.
need to be who you say you are. And you need to actually give a crap about that person on the other side all year long, right? It's not just this thing we can
Yeah,
say and move on from.
yeah. No, it has
Not
to
to,
be, and you could even be authentic in that moment. I'm not saying that people that say that are not being authentic, but if you haven't put in the work prior to then, you're not going to get the response,
right,
you know? And some leaders, let's be honest, don't want to hear it. So they're saying it because they want to check that box,
right.
right? Let's just call it what it is. Um, but if you're really trying to build a collaborative team and you're trying to create the most functional outcomes, then it's really important to develop those relationships and make people feel safe so that they can share their points. And believe me, I've been in some very, very sticky and uncomfortable meetings that I'm rather proud of how what the outcomes were, um, because of that, knowing your people, and knowing how to navigate people and knowing how to navigate a meeting, which is a separate conversation also.
Yes.
We're having
Yeah,
like 12
definitely.
different conversations here.
No, but it's good. And, I think it all revolves around how important it is to communicate.
Yes.
So it's just, like I said, to start this out, communication to me is such an important part of building relationships because people can get to know you and you can get to know
Mhm.
them. And I think once you break that barrier of this facade that we put up, where you can get to the individual person and know kind of their inner workings and how they need to be heard, you can accomplish so much more. And I think there's so many people who resort to force or this behavioral struggle when they communicate something and they don't get back the response they want. They default into saying it louder,
Hmm.
yelling it, demanding it, and that it rarely works, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen this before when someone maybe they have this behavioral thing where they don't communicate it well. What happens when you try and push that person harder, right? They're not going to suddenly give up. They're going to
Nope.
dig in.
Hmm. Yeah. And you know what? Also, too, when you are an effective leader and you have built that team and you have built that trust and all the things, you know, part of leadership is to not always deliver comfortable news, right? Like let's have a cohesive conversation here, right? So, when you have to deliver news that is not so favorable, you know, people may not be excited to receive it, but they know it's coming from you and knowing that you have exhausted all possibilities before getting to this point. So
Right.
they have trust in you, they have faith in you, and that goes a long way in terms of culture and climate.
It definitely does. I think a lot of people look at, hey, I love you. I don't want to say this because I don't want to hurt your feelings. But
Right,
I would challenge the opposite. When you love someone or you really respect and appreciate someone, you have to have those conversations with them
right.
because it comes from a place of love and it comes from the intentionality behind it. Is not, I'm not saying this because I want you to be embarrassed or I want you to feel at fault or blamed, but I'm
Hmm.
telling you this because I believe that you'd want to know it because of what you're capable of. I
Right.
think that has a lot to do with intentionality and character as well from the delivery.
And also building human capacity, right? Like if you really want to lift the people that are around you, you have to have those conversations, because not only are you have, as a lead, you have goals, right? You have things that you have to achieve. not only personally and professionally, but like in a system. Like there are
Right.
things, tasks that you have to do. Like that's why we have jobs. Let's be honest. But um, not only are you achieving those tasks and goals and objectives, but also when you lead like that, you're also building capacity and you're showing others how it can get done.
Right. So let me ask you this. How important, from your perspective, do you think it is for someone to be an effective communicator or an effective leader to do the work first on themselves to build that capacity?
Well, I think it's critical, and I'm speaking from first person perspective here because, like I said, I'm sitting in a position now that 20 years ago I despised as a subservient, right? And I think that had I not done the work, both professionally and personally, I couldn't be the leader I am, honestly. And um, I don't think that I would get the outcomes that I have. I think it's important, to work on yourself first. And sometimes, unfortunately, you don't know that you need to work on yourself. Someone around you telling you is not enough. You have to go through some challenges. You have to, have that grit, you
Yeah,
know.
no, I strongly agree. So I got two questions left on my heart to ask
Sure.
you, if you would. Question number one: if you can give someone one piece of tangible advice where they can implement today to be a little bit more effective in communication or just be a better person overall, what do you think that piece of advice might be?
Oh my God. So, my good friend, her name is Dana, not an alter ego, like an actual friend. um, I remember she told me this phrase, and I keep it very close to my heart because I used to work in absolutes. I was very goal driven and I worked in absolutes. And I've learned that that does not work in real life with real humans. So she has said to me, never say never and never say always. And I use that as like my guide, my North Star. Never say never and never say always. Because if I lived by that, I wouldn't be here, you know? So that's my one piece of tangible advice. And calendaring your circle backs.
That's a good one. I'll definitely
Yeah.
take that in.
Yeah, sure.
So my second question for you, which may be
Mhm.
the most important one: what's your favorite type of cake?
Oh my God. So I don't eat cake.
All
I
right.
know.
Well, if you had to pick one,
I don't like cake, but I love like a chocolate flourless torte.
okay, we can classify that in the cake field for
Okay.
this
I like
conversation.
anything with dark chocolate and maybe some fruit, like a raspberry or an apricot or orange.
All right,
Hope that helps.
we'll take that. Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be no have cakes if we didn't talk about cake somewhere in there. But
I'm here for anything chocolate.
good. Oh, good to know. I'll make note of that. So, in all seriousness, though, I do genuinely appreciate your willingness to share in this, and I know personally I've taken a lot out of this conversation about communication and how to properly communicate. And like I said, it's such an important part, I think, of being an effective leader and an effective person that I really could talk on communication all day long. So
Samesies.
thank you so much for being willing to share.
My
And
pleasure.
is there anywhere that you would direct people to go for following up on this, or getting in touch with you, or where do we go from here?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on X. I think it's Dana underscore Battaglia underscore one. Or if you just go Dana Battaglia, you would be able to find me. Um, I have an email address also. It's dbattagliaslp@gmail.org. Um, and yeah, I think that's it. I'm on Facebook under my own name. I'm pretty boring. I don't have any crazy pseudonyms or anything like that. So I'd love to connect with anyone who has questions or comments or wants to talk a little bit more. And, because we're on a journey. And I feel like, before you hit the record button, I was saying that I love listening to podcasts. So I feel like this is my give back, and I'm happy to do so. It was an honor to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. And it was definitely an honor to have you here. So thank you again. And I really appreciate it.